Maybe it was in the water crooked. Thanks for finding your way to another video. I want to thank everyone that watched that Heydays video I put out a couple weeks ago. That thing performed incredible, way better than I thought it would for being almost an hour long. So thank you to everyone who watched that and gave it a thumbs up or shared it, all that good stuff. Again, thank you so much. Your views and support really help the channel and get partners on board for moving forward to bring you guys new content and new ideas and things to try. So again, thank you guys. Moving into today's video, we're going to start off doing some suspension work on Jason's build here. So this is my customer Jason, brought in this 650 XC that had been in a flood, up to the bars in water overnight. Last season, when he dropped it off, I went through and cleaned up some of the connectors and pins and stuff like that and just got it working again. So everything starts and runs as it should, aside from some small issues with the recoil and starter and whatever. Those will be addressed later, but this thing is in for an entire clone build of my 862 VR1 build back there. The only difference really is going to be that we're using the cross-country spindle instead of the super tall 600R snowcross spindle. Other than that, it's the exact same build, 862 stroker, Long Tail Torsion Springs, Hygear Linkage in the back, cross-country shocks up front, taller spindles, all the goodies, right? Literally just duplicating that thing into this. We got a lot of work to do on this thing. Luckily, we've got a while before the snow flies, and as you can see, I still got some car stuff in here lingering around, so it's a bit of a Jenga game in the shop right now. Today, we're gonna dig into swapping out the front shocks, probably pulling the skid and taking some stuff out of that. These QS3s have to go to Andy on a trade-in program. We've got all the new walkers in a box over there, so let's get into it. In classic flood water fashion, I'm expecting a lot of the hardware is going to look like this, so dump truck. So a lot of cleanup on hardware, wire wheel, grease, back in. This thing is white. So up front, along with swapping to the cross-country shock, which has a traditional reservoir, rebound adjust on the shaft and high and low, instead of a dual rate setup, Jason's going to be running my progressive spring here. Starts at an 80-pound rate, finishes at a 135. No crossover stack to adjust. You don't have to cut the plastic off the body. You don't have the aluminum collars wearing on the shock body and tearing the shock body all up. Just one simple spring. These are available on my web store. I got a link below in the description, jobber down there if anyone wants to order them. Got quite a few on hand right now, so we'll see how that stock lasts throughout the season, but they are available now and ready to go. This is not the final installation for these, so don't have O-rings on the upper heims right here. When you do have these with brand new O-rings, they can be quite tricky to get into here. Sometimes you gotta take pliers to squeeze the O-rings together to get them to slide in. So a little pro tip for you moving forward if you're putting yours in with the O-rings. But since these are coming back out later, we're just putting them in right now without the O-rings just to get by. Got our bolt all cleaned up. Both right sides were really crusty. The left side, only the lower one was for some reason. Maybe it was in the water crooked. All right. right, now that the front shocks are in, we're waiting on the rest of the front stuff because the spindles, cross-country ones, are going out to be powder coated and machined for the RMK spacers. Also got to drill the sway bar and stuff, so the front is just kind of loosely buttoned together for now. Gonna move on to the rear, pull the skid out, start swapping all the shocks over, using my template, marking and drilling for the long tails, all that good stuff. So off we go. Pretty dirty and full of just stuff from sitting after being in the water, sitting in the trailer, yada yada yada. I'm gonna go ahead, take it outside, hose it all down, let it sit in the sun over lunch, and then throw it back up here and start blowing it apart. I'll probably just disassemble the entire thing and grease everything and go through it all and clean it because, like I said, it's been in water overnight, so we don't want any of that coming back to haunt us down the road. Go through it once and be done with it. While that skid's drying, I'm still waiting for Elbird to come out here so we can figure out what we're doing for lunch. We'll assemble this front track shock here, show you the process of putting a dual rate on one of these bad boys. This is a brand new front track shock we got from Andy. Let's see here. Still has the plastic, so we gotta go and cut this little thing off so we can put the rattly boys over top of it. Do I have enough disc left on this? Oh yeah, we got enough disc, barely. So these, you wanna go ahead and cut through here and be careful not to get into the body of the shock. Once you get close, you can just take a screwdriver and pop it right apart. There we go. Oh, once you're close, take a screwdriver, split it. Come on now. If you're not familiar with the dual rate, let's go over that real quick. You have your mainspring, you've got your divider, your tender spring, and these are your crossover shims to determine your crossover stack height. So essentially the two springs combined make a softer rate than your main spring. You go from, so essentially your two springs combined are a softer rate than your main spring here. Your crossover stack assembly here determines how much travel you have on your initial rate before the crossover touches the upper collar here, and then you switch over to your main rate. So that's why you get multiple of these. That's all adjustable depending on how soon you want that to encounter, how late you want it to happen. You can fine tune that if you'd like to. I don't recommend putting all of these in. I think that's way too much. I normally run either just the 1/4 inch or the 3/8, depending on the rider and what they're looking for. On this machine here, I'm gonna go with the 3/8 shim so that it comes onto that main rate a little bit sooner than running the 1/4 inch and what I normally do. So once you kind of figure that out where you want to run that, you can disregard your other ones, keep your one here. Spring assembly goes on this way. Also, keep in mind that your divider here does normally have a difference in height side to side. I tend to stick the shorter side up like this, on our shock like that. Your next move is going to be to move your bump stop down, get your retainer out. Sometimes those can be on there pretty heavy or stuck in pretty good. Then you take your one crossover shim, find our shorter side. Oh, got ahead of ourselves. Crossover shim, come on. Tender, boop. Short side, boop. Mainspring, retainer back in. A bit more. This is a long setup. There you go. Spin this back down. And now I don't do any preload stuff with this until it's assembled in the skid. Unfortunately, with our stock skid setups and stock limiter, you end up compressing this shock almost an inch just to get it all assembled in there. So I leave it like this until I start going to put it in, then I'll back this all the way off, assemble it into the skid, and then set our preload from there. So we'll get back into that later. Did some time lapse of that rear axle, disassembly and cleaning and all that. This outer wheel and bolt was seized on there pretty good. So kind of glad I went and did that. Just little stuff, like I said, again, keep reiterating over and over. It was underwater for who knows how long. So all that gets in there, and it's just nice to go ahead and clean it all up. Moving on to pulling the torsion springs off. After the torsion springs are off, I'm just gonna continue to rip and tear and pull the shock out, link rods and front track and all that stuff. Got to pull the front torque arm out of the lower mount here so I can use my template to locate our new hole for the long tail torsions. We'll get into that a little bit more in depth here in a minute once all this stuff is apart. Here's something a little spooky. Pulling this left-hand side torsion spring out. Notice the mount felt a little goofy. You don't like to see that. I'm gonna keep hammering home that this thing was a flood sled so that any of you guys ever buy a flood sled, you know this is the kind of stuff you're gonna have to look out for. Gonna need a couple bearings up top here. Brief update while I hop in the truck and go to the store. The local bearing place wanted $49 each for those 6007 bearings. No way, dude. So that just means that the skid is gonna have to come back out on Saturday when other bearings show up, because I don't have the space for that thing to sit there all torn apart for the next 4 days. I hate trying to get these things off of here. Oh, thank God whoever put these on didn't do it very tight. So these are going right in the trash, and we're going to be using the newer HD APM fab mounts instead. Doing the retrofit for the long tails is pretty straightforward. You got to get your skid to this point, get the front torque arm out of there and all that stuff. I'm sure someone will find a way to do this in the sled, but if you're buying the template from me, which this is the original I made last season for the 129, this location is within a couple millimeters of the factory Polaris location. That said, when you do it on a VR1 or an XC, this cutout is very close. You end up down in this region. You don't have a lot of material between your hole and here, probably about 1/4 inch, give or take. That was fine on my personal sled. Ran that all season long. Didn't encounter any issues. The rail didn't crack. It didn't blow apart. So that's what I'm sticking with for these templates. Run that at your own risk. If you want to move it and go up here a little bit farther, this will at least give you a guideline. Just like other stuff, these are available on the web store. Link in the description. Take your stock bolt assembly here. Washer. Go through your template. Through the rail. Thread this guy in. You don't really need to thread it in all the way and tighten it up. You get the idea of what's going on here, but if you want to, you can tighten that all the way up. We've got play in this here, drop that down. It's very close with the idler bracket as well, so you're kind of very limited on where this can and has to go. Make your little mark. Do that however you want. You can also just take your center punch, pop that in there. There you go. That's pretty much it. That gives you just enough clearance on the backside for the bolt head to come through, for your new mount, all that stuff. That's pretty much that. Drill your hole, put your front torque arm back together, obviously once you do the other side, and then reassemble from there. So there was just a 1/8 inch pilot bit, 5/16 final bit. That's for your traditional M8 style hardware like we include on APM Fabrication HD mounts. Off you go. I do recommend once you get your hole done, take a countersink bit, just slightly chamfer the edge of that hole. Should help prevent some cracking. On this, obviously, I got to remove the rear shock and the inner idlers and all that to do the Hygear kit, so I'll chamfer that inside then. So there is a little bit more disassembly that should be done if you're going to chamfer those holes. If you're just going to risk it and send it, this is as far as you need to go. Awkward lean in here. While we're on the subject, if you do get these APM fabrication mounts from me, off of my web store, they will come with a small washer and a big washer. If you're doing a standard replacement with your torsion spring back here, you can use the big washer on the inside. If you're doing a retrofit, there isn't enough clearance between the idler wheel bracket and the hole to run the big washer, so that's where you'll run the small washer on the inside, nut, washer, rail. Dokie, it is Hygear time. So the Hygear instructions say, take your shock, do this number here, then do your link rods up through, then start by attaching the link rods to here, then the top shock, and then finagle this down into the lower arm. So, let's try it. Like they talk about in the instructions, there's this overcamming that happens when it's assembled such as this, and especially once the torsion springs are on, forcing all this back. You can see the front here. I don't know if you can very well. I'll do a zoom in with the phone. You can see right here that it overcams past where it's supposed to be. So let's do this number. Push. When you push up from the bottom, watch your fingers in here, and then push the torque arm down to compress the rear shock. You can see how the pivot comes up to where it's supposed to be. Right now it'll stay because there's no torsion springs on it. Like I said, right now it'll stay because there's no torsion springs, but this is roughly the position that it needs to be in when you install it. So what I will do is once I put torsion springs on it and stuff, I will ratchet strap this rear arm to the front one here. That way it kind of stays together in this position to get it into the machine, and then release the ratchet strap. That way this doesn't overcam, putting your spread between the front torque arm and the rear torque arm too far apart to get it bolted into the skid, or the chassis rather, skid bolted into the chassis. But for now, we can just let it overcam and hang out right there. Now that the Hygear link is installed, all I have to do is tighten and torque down all the fasteners and then start reassembling the skid. Doesn't really matter whether I do torsion springs and then the torque arm, or the torque arm and then the torsion springs. I just gotta throw it all back together and then back in the sled. Unfortunately, it will have to come back out so that I can replace these bearings because, like I said, local place wanted a fortune, had to order some online. They'll be here in a couple days, so once those are here, pull it back out, swap those quick, throw it back in. One other thing before the torque arm goes back in for good, we're gonna get rid of, gonna get rid, come on. Well, gonna get rid of the plastic bushings inside the torque arm. Got some Indy Specialty bronze light ones here. I just got to punch them out because they are awfully gross and corroded in here from its night in the water. So blast those out, probably do a quick wire wheel inside the barrels here, grease everything, throw those in, continue on with our reassembly. Hey. Come on! So on these lower front torque arm bolts here, what I like to do is put a little bit of blue Loctite on the thread out here and then grease the non-threaded portion of the bolt on this end. You don't want to get grease on your threads and then apply Loctite because it won't dry and it won't seep. So remember that if you're going to go ahead and Loctite these in, because it's kind of an important bolt down in here, and I have had one back out in the past on my Assault. Well, I don't know if it backed out or if it sheared clean off because we lost all of this. But either way, something to keep in mind. If you get grease on the threads, your Loctite's not going to. Hopefully all this is in frame. Top of my head's probably going to be cut off a little bit, but we're at the point now of reassembling the front torque arm with the front track shock here and doing our preload and everything on this as we get the limiter strap hooked up. All right, so yeah. This seems like a long spring. That's wild. I gotta go do some measuring. I think this is longer than what we normally get. All right, so long story short, I got out my setup sheets, which I have all recorded of spring lengths and preloads and all that stuff that I run on my personal sleds and customer sleds. This tender is 1/2 inch too long. Whether Hygear updated for some reason and is now running a 2.5 inch instead of a 2 inch, I don't know. I called Andy, talked to him. He's gonna call Hygear, sort all that out. So luckily this whole thing has to come back apart to do the idler bearings anyway, or idler wheel bearings. But for now, the skid is mostly back together, a couple small things, stuff at the sled, and that will kind of wrap up the majority of the suspension stuff for now. Today, that's all we got. All right, back at it. We've got the correct tender spring now. Got to pull the skid back out, throw it on the bench, upper idler bearings, tender spring, front track shock boot, and then back in the sled, and then the suspension is pretty well wrapped up. I have the O-rings for the front shocks as well. So I'm gonna go ahead, wrap all the suspension stuff up, and that'll be it until we get some time to do the whole engine swap. I'm gonna start by swapping out the tender spring. Yeah, again, not sure exactly what happened. Andy's full batch had this 3-inch spring instead of the 2.5. So not really sure where things got mixed up there. Doesn't really matter. I caught it, got it all sorted. So let's get it fixed up. So while I'm messing with this strap here to undo the limiter, might as well talk about spring preload on the front track shock. I've got these pretty well sorted of where I set people up in terms of doing the simpler preload measurement from the bridge here to the collar, measuring that gap for preload instead of doing your overall free length versus your compressed length to do your preload, because a lot of times once the boot's on, it's very difficult to do it that way, which is the proper way. You take your overall free length and you set your preload based on the difference, right? So once it's compressed, say your free length is 12 inches, you put your preload in, you're at 11.5, you've got 1/2 inch of preload, right? Right way to go about doing it. Easier method when the boot's in and stuff is you just measure from your bridge to your collar. That's normally what I end up doing on front ski springs and stuff like that too, is I don't really end up pulling them off to measure the free length and stuff, and I just kind of get a baseline of where they work well, write down what that measurement is between the bridge and the collar, and adjust from there. But again, like some things, you know, it's not the right way to go about doing it. Does it work? Yes. Is it the proper way? No. Again, reiterating, with the boot on there, You're pretty limited on how you can go about doing it. Why? There you go. Why did I do that so tight? So for this example, we are just going to leave everything right in the sled like this. And we're just gonna do this number, one of these, take that out, wrong. Make sure the rate's the same, yep, okay. That is a good, short side, 3/8. Yeah, let's do this. There's that. That's better. We need our boot. So, people swear you don't need the boot when you go to a traditional spring setup or the dual rate with a wider coil. Probably true. I had a stock one ice up before when I pulled the boot off of a stock style progressive spring. Probably could also flip the progressive, so the tighter wound coils are up here instead of down on the body. Either way, no boot, stock spring, turned into a solid rod of ice. So I always run the boot back on these things just to be safe, because it is no fun when your ride gets ruined because you have a solid rod in here instead of a front track shock. Not worth it to me. I feel like I can't mutter anything under my breath now because of this new mic. It's gonna pick up everything. I'm just gonna sound even weirder. Do be pretty weird though. Getting text from Andy to throw the boot away. I will not. We will not throw the boot away. Dude is so mad about that boot. Buddy hates boots. Almost. Watch your block. All right. Is this a joke? There we go. It's the best way to start these. That's pretty much gonna wrap up the suspension segment of this one. The rear skid is all done and in for good. The front is pretty much in and done for good. Left front shock is gonna have to come out though to replace the upper A-arm. That's got a dent in it. Aside from that, it's just the spindles up front left, and then that will really wrap it up for the suspension stuff. So whenever I get some time in the near future, dig into the engine swap. But until then, thanks for watching.